Hi, everyone. Before we dive into today's episode of the AgNext Podcast, we have an exciting announcement. This summer, the AgNext team is hosting the third AgNext Research Summit.
This event will bring together leading experts, industry professionals, researchers, and academics to advance the conversation on sustainable animal agriculture.
The event will be held from June 10th to the 13th in Fort Collins, Colorado. And we are offering our podcast listeners 10% off the price of the Research Summit using the promo code AgNextPod.
For more information about this exciting event and to register, visit agnext.colostate.edu.
We hope to see you there.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the AgNext Podcast. Today we are speaking with our team member, Dr. Jason Lombard, a veterinarian, epidemiologist, and dairy systems specialist at AgNext. We will be speaking with him about highly pathogenic avian influenza, HPAI, or HPAI, as most of us refer to it as, and his work studying the disease. Let's get into it. Welcome back, Jason. It's so nice to have you back on the podcast. You have been working with HPAI now for a year?
Almost a year. It'll be 11 months tomorrow.
Incredible.
From when it was first detected.
Incredible.
Wow. Confirmed.
Jason, welcome back. As Kim said, you're an epidemiologist in dairy cows, and you mentioned that you've been working with this for about a year. So USDA, you used to work with the USDA, now you work here with CSU. USDA called you to lead some of the research in HPAI. Can you tell us more about this role, what you've been doing, and maybe take a chronological view on how things have changed over this year?
Sure. So as we mentioned, March 25th, 2024 was when HPAI was confirmed, influenza A virus confirmed in dairy cattle in Texas. And I think the end of that week, I was on a conference call with USDA as they were trying to figure out where to go next. And then on April 2nd, which I'm kind of interesting, it wasn't April Fool's Day, but April 2nd, I got asked to come and go out to Michigan and help them work up an investigation where the virus had moved from dairy cattle to poultry.
So it moved from dairy to poultry at the time. And
right.
what they were asking you to investigate on that, and how was...
Try to figure out how it moved from poultry or from cattle to poultry. And so most of the investigation was with the state and some of the federal people in Michigan. But what they ended up finding out was there were workers on the poultry side that were working at the dairy on the weekends, which 6 months before then wouldn't have been any kind of problem because we didn't really share diseases with dairy cattle and poultry. But there were a number of workers that did work on the dairy, and that's how we think it probably got from the dairy back to the poultry farm.
Interesting.
And what's USDA's interest in the disease? Why would they have contacted you and asked you to go investigate this particular issue?
So highly pathogenic avian influenza is a poultry disease and a bird disease. And so it's been circulating in wild migratory birds for a number of years and was first detected in the U.S. in 2022, in February 2022. And in terms of USDA's response to highly pathogenic influenza, that is a foreign animal disease. And so when it's detected, then they depopulate the animals, birds, because as long as those poultry are alive, they're going to be producing more and more virus. And we know that it's highly pathogenic, meaning it kills the majority of the domestic poultry that it comes in contact with. So when we have a million head layer facility, even though maybe 50,000 birds or something are showing disease, they go ahead and depopulate all of them because they know that eventually the disease will move through the entire housing facility, potentially through the whole facility, multiple housing facilities. And so in order to decrease the amount of virus that's being generated, and for animal welfare reasons, they go in and depopulate all of the birds on the premises.
So your work is really looking at transmission of the disease, going from one operation to another, basically looking at how it's moving.
That's one big aspect, is how is it moving? The other is what are the clinical signs that dairy cattle are showing? Where are they shedding the virus? How long are they shedding the virus? Which is all ties back to transmission, because if cattle are moving, we need to know where they're most likely going to be excreting the virus, because that's where we'd want to test in order to approve or disapprove those from cattle from moving.
Excellent. So you brought up the cows, right? It's a bird disease, and now it has been shown to be in cows as well. What are the symptoms? Like you mentioned that there's the symptoms. What are the symptoms that the cows show when they have the virus, and what are the potential negative effects on milk production as well? Is there any long-term effect that the virus can have on those animals? Since I'm assuming like it's going to be hard to do the same thing that you're doing in the poultry industry, right?
Right. We don't depopulate cattle at this time because even though we call it high path AI, it's not highly pathogenic in cattle. It does cause disease. It causes probably not a lot different from what most of us would feel like if we had the influenza. So they do go off feed. And then their rumination really slows down. They go down in milk production. Most cows have a fever at the beginning of that episode, and it seems to vary a little bit from farm to farm in terms of some farms will have a lot of cows with mastitis, and some cows tend to have more respiratory disease. The one thing that we saw a lot on the farms in Colorado and California was nasal discharge. So that was another clinical sign that was pretty common.
And is that like you just mentioned, is that the most common? Like how, if I'm a producer and I suspecting is there anything that you say, even though there's different symptoms, there is one that it's greater likelihood that this animal is sick or something like that?
Yeah, I think that the pretty dramatic decrease in milk production is probably the number one sign where we've got data on cows. And it seems like the most productive cows, the ones that are producing the most milk, are going to be the ones that have the most dramatic impact. So cows that are milking 100 and 120 pounds of milk per day, we see those cows drop to like less than 10 pounds per day.
Wow. And that's most likely due to a decrease in probably feed intake, right? Or you don't?
Well, secondary to the viral infection and fever, and probably there's a lot of factors that are released that make us feel like crap when we have the flu. Yeah. Same kind of thing with the cows.
What about long-term effects? Have you after the cow has the disease, do they go back to normal? Is that something that you have been able to investigate?
So we've looked at that on a few farms, and there are a percentage of the cows that are euthanized because they're not really recovering or they're really, really sick, and that's a producer decision. A lot of the cattle that don't come back into milk production and maybe aren't pregnant and are late in lactation, those cows get sold. Mm-hmm. And we're just starting to follow cows that have had the disease in their previous lactation, and now what are they doing in terms of milk production in the current lactation. And some of the experimental studies showed a lot of scar tissue formation in the mammary gland. So we were worried about, is there going to be a functional decrease in the amount of milk these cows can produce? Because we know that when they go through the disease, they are on the lactation curve. They go through a disease where they have a really decreased amount of milk produced. They don't come back up to their normal lactation curve. They come up to about 70%. Mm-hmm. So there's an impact in the current lactation, but then what's the impact in the future lactation in terms of milk production? And right now, I would say that from the one farm we have, it doesn't appear that there is going to be an impact. So that's good. But there's other impacts that happen during the infection that we know of. Abortions.
Yes.
Pretty common on a lot of farms, but not all farms. And then we also know that the reproductive efficiency of cattle can be impacted as well. And that could be for a variety of reasons. When these farms have so many cattle that are sick, they have to get resources from other places. So they might not breed cattle for a few weeks as they're treating cows.
I see.
That can impact their production or reproduction.
The disease impacting some of the management practices of the farm that's potentially impacting the cow later on. Not the disease itself impacting the preg rate, for example, or something like that.
Right. And that's something that's hard to tease apart.
Yeah.
But I think that the other thing that we've heard from some of our collaborators in California is an increase in twinning, which I think there is a physiological reason for that. With decreased progesterone leads to multiple ovulations in cattle, but we haven't seen that across, and we haven't documented that in multiple herds yet. So that was at the time of pregnancy check. We have looked at some herds some of those cows have come back and calved, but they could have been pregnant before the disease.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, Jason, how are these dairy producers kind of adapting to these challenges? So you mentioned that every herd is affected differently. You mentioned that reproduction can be significantly decreased kind of as cows come back from experiencing the disease. How are dairy producers working through that? What decisions are they making on the farm to adjust to those challenges?
Yeah, so I think it's a really bad 3 to 4 week period for most dairy producers and their employees. And I think they try to survive through that and try to save as many cows as they can that need help. And I think they get to the point where they have to triage cows and this cow, she's not doing real well, but she'll make it. And this cow, if we don't intervene and provide her what she needs, then she might not make it. So I think that during that period of time, they're just trying to take the best care of their cows that they can, and then kind of see what comes out the other end in terms of how many cows have we lost, how many cows are we going to have to sell because they're not productive anymore.
Are you seeing producers having to buy bred heifers, for example, or replace cows that they've lost? Or do you think they're just going to kind of replace sort of inside the herd?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have much information on that other than one farm that we worked with that did have an ample source of heifers, so they did bring a lot of heifers in, and they probably culled cows a little bit harder than some of the other farms.
Great.
That's very interesting. One of the things that I'm getting here, Jason, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a lot of variation, right? A lot of different things that you see from farm to farm and to one farm to the other. Are there common things like best practices that you've seen on the best farms that you have to deal with versus the other ones that you see they're facing more challenges? Like, are there better practices that those farms take than the others should be watching and taking? What are some of the practices that you've seen, probably first to prevent the disease, and maybe second, what to do after, like after you see a case or something like that? And why are those practices important, and how can they implement that to the farm or not?
Those are really good questions. We don't have many answers to that. We know that almost every state that it's moved to outside of Texas was through cattle movements. So those have been, USDA knows where those cattle came from, and they can trace that directly back to their origin. So as far as a biosecurity, not bringing on cattle, if you can, is good for a multitude of diseases, not just highly pathogenic avian influenza. So that would be one. The other thing that I think we're still trying to figure this out, but initially the virus is most commonly found in milk at high concentrations. And so everybody was kind of focused on it's the milk that's how the virus is being transmitted. But then we know that somewhere between 40 and 50% of the farms in the U.S. that have become infected based on the USDA survey weren't bringing in cattle. So how's it moving into those farms? And at least talking to the folks in Colorado and California, they're under the impression that this is moving probably a lot with aerosol. Could be moving with paradomestic birds, so pigeons, sparrows, those types of birds as well. But we don't really have hard evidence for any of those. When we first went to Michigan and we were looking at how is the disease spreading in Michigan, and there was a lot of underreporting that was going on and probably has gone on in most states other than Colorado and California, where they did bulk tank milk testing and so they knew. But in Michigan, there were a lot of farms, I think, that weren't reporting as well. And so we went and we tested milk trucks, because if milk is the primary source of virus, so we were a little ways into it, but we knew we had milk coming from infected farms, and we found 1 out of 126 samples that were positive. So we're like, well, milk trucks aren't quite the risk we thought they might be. And so we just keep, I think as we've gone through this, at least from my perspective, we look at these different pathways. And so aerosol transmission would be another one where we've done a lot of air sampling on farms in Colorado, farms in California, and I think out of the 100+ samples, we've probably got like 4 positives. And so it's not easy to find how it's moving between farms.
But that's interesting. Goes back to Kim's question about the heifers. Like, what if I have to buy heifers to replace the cows that I have to cut? Like, probably have to pay special attention on that, where those heifers are coming from. And maybe, I don't know if it's possible to test them before they get to the herd or something like that.
Yeah, so they're the antigen test, so the PCR test to look for the virus itself, has been used on nasal swabs. Currently, the federal order requires, in most states, require testing milk, which is the best place to test. But as you mentioned, some classes of animals aren't lactating yet. And so how do we test those animals? And so looking for antibodies is probably the best through blood tests to see if they've been exposed or not. And we do know that heifers prior to calving, from pre-weaned up till calving, do have antibodies. So they've been exposed and developed antibodies. Whether those are protective against them is not 100% clear, but we do know that based on an N of 2 cows that were looked at USDA Agricultural Research Service study, when they exposed those cows to virus, they actually fed milk to the cows in their feed for a period of time, and then they tried to challenge them with intramammary inoculation of the virus. Those cows didn't get sick.
Interesting.
So it does seem that exposure through either the oral or respiratory route may confer some intramammary protection from disease.
Interesting. You started the conversation saying it came from potentially a poultry barn to the. What about humans who are working different farms and maybe people who goes from one farm to the other? I know that's probably something that we should do every time that we go from one farm to the other, but can you just go over some of the procedures or the practice that, just saying that again, like those are the things that you should watch when you go from one farm to the other, or just across, I don't know, like across multiple farms from the same owner or things like that? Are those things that we should watch and do every time that we walk from one farm to the other?
Yeah, so really equipment and clothing should stay on the farm. So ideally boots, coveralls, those types of clothing should stay on the farm where they're used and be laundered there, and you should use different personal protective equipment essentially as you go to the other farm. In terms of when we were sampling, we had a couple kind of rules that we followed. I mean, a lot of rules, but a couple rules in particular according to that was, one is we always washed our truck when we left a farm. So we went to the closest car wash, got the truck washed, and we didn't go to more than one farm in a day. So we always would shower, wash the truck, clean coveralls, clean boots and everything before we went to the next farm. And even though these farms were infected that we were going to, we didn't want to introduce a new strain of the virus to them.
Yeah.
Sure.
And sometimes take somewhere else too, like you're going to the same farm every day, then for some reason you had to stop in a different farm and maybe you're taking somewhere else. I don't know.
Right.
So Jason, it doesn't sound like we know yet how the virus is moving. I have 2 questions for you, kind of thinking about our listeners who are dairy producers. The first question is, can herds get reinfected, or do they carry some sort of inoculation to the disease? Do we know? Can herds get reinfected?
So there have been probably a dozen herds in Texas that had clinical signs very similar to their initial clinical signs somewhere between 4 and 6 months later.
Okay.
They have been unable to detect the virus in those cows that are getting sick.
Interesting. Okay.
So as far as reinfection, we don't have any evidence saying it does or does not occur.
Okay.
We do have cows that we've followed that have been shedding the virus in milk, where they'll go maybe 3 or 4 weeks where we don't find any virus after their last shedding event, and then we detect it again. And we don't know if that's intermittent shedding, intermittent detection.
Sure.
And usually the the best way to determine that would be to look at the whole genome sequence of the virus, because that's the fingerprint, and we could say, is this a new virus infecting this cow or not?
Right.
The problem is that we have to have enough virus
To do that work.
To do that work. And usually by the time we get out that far, there's not enough virus. We're talking about less than 10 viral particles in the sample that we have.
Interesting. Okay. So then my next follow-up question is, what's on the horizon for these producers? I mean, is there a potential vaccine coming? Is it just going to be that every cow has to get infected with HPAI now? What options do our producers have? And then I want to switch gears and talk about research, because clearly there's lots of that still needs to be done. Yeah.
Right. So as far as a vaccine, there is vaccine work ongoing. And I'm not sure how close it is to being available for producers, but I probably heard last week there was vaccine approved for poultry.
Great.
Which is really good for them.
Yes.
And so we'll kind of see how that goes. It's a little different vaccinating a few million layers.
Eggs. Yeah, they'll give vaccines to eggs. Yeah.
So we'll see, but that should be on the horizon for cattle in the near future.
Essentially, in the future, biosecurity remains top of mind, and a vaccine that will hopefully help alleviate. Right. Okay, great. Yep. So I do want to just touch a little bit, not only on your research. I want to know what do you have planned next, but can you also just talk a little bit about the importance of continuing to evaluate this disease?
Sure. So this disease, I think, is, there's people that have spent their lives studying influenza from the human side, because that's where it's more prevalent, and in the poultry side too. But in the cattle side, obviously, this is new. So that's influenza A is what we're talking about. Influenza D is typically what cattle would get. We don't know much about influenza D either, other than it could be associated with bovine respiratory disease complex, maybe one of the viruses that makes them more susceptible to other viral infections. So influenza A with cattle is pretty new. And so the first what we call a spillover event, or the transmission from wild migratory birds to cattle, was a one-time event that happened somewhere late 2023, early 2024 in Southwest Texas area. Based on all the sequencing that they've done of the viruses, that's the B3.13 virus. And then they were able to follow that and show that spread to all the cattle. There wasn't another introduction through wild migratory birds. So that was a one-time. But
we don't know how it's moving cattle to cattle to cattle.
We don't know, well, other than we know that the movement of cattle is one.
Does something, yeah. But not all of them. Not explained by all. Okay, right. Interesting.
So in the last month now, though, we've had 3 new spillovers with the D1.1 strain of influenza A in Nevada and Arizona. So the D1.1 is the most common genotype that we're seeing in poultry in the Midwest and eastern part of the U.S. in the last probably 4 to 6 months. So now we've got a new challenge ahead of us, because the B313 wasn't really prevalent in the wild migratory birds. I think there were 3 detections of that before it showed up in dairy cattle. One of those was in Colorado and one was in Wyoming, interestingly enough. But that hasn't been seen in wild migratory birds since it was discovered in cattle. But now we've got D1.1 that's kind of really prevalent in the wild migratory birds. And if it's transmitting that easily to cattle, that's a big concern, I think, because
now we have a new vector, wild birds.
Yeah, before it was
potentially
a single time, and now could this
be a new? I don't want to say new. Could this be another source?
Yeah, and so to have 3 spillovers with this within a couple months, compared to we only had 1 that we can genetically confirm.
And are those cows having different responses in Arizona and Nevada, or are they similar? Is the virus worse?
So we haven't heard much about what's going on there. I think it's from the little bit I've gathered, it's about the same.
Okay.
The thing that's a little bit scarier is that the D1.1 seems to be more pathogenic in people. So the B313, as far as I know, there were no hospitalizations from infection with that strain, influenza A. The D1.1 strain, there was a teenager in British Columbia that was hospitalized in intensive care for a while. They've since recovered. But then there was also a Louisiana elderly person that had some underlying health problems that actually died with the complications of D1.1. So I think the biggest concern is if we get D1.1 in our cattle populations and those are transmitted to workers and owners, is that going to be a bigger health issue from the human side? And so, talking about influenza, we've heard about pandemics, and that's, I think, one of the things that is still sitting down there simmering. Is this going to eventually turn into a pandemic? And we sure hope it doesn't.
Interesting.
So on the research front, can you describe kind of what's happening? So I'm hearing there's still quite a bit of work happening around the cow. And then there's now, especially perhaps, more interest or attention or energy being placed on a new strain that could be moving differently. Is that shaping in that way, Jason, or is it about to?
As far as a new strain, I don't know if I don't really know what's going on specifically in Nevada and Arizona in terms of, I assume that they're going to implement some of the same research activities in those herds that we've implemented in Colorado.
Sure.
I can tell you that the human health, the public health folks have been focused on this pretty much since the beginning. I think they've been tuned into what's going on because of the potential for, and we heard a lot of reports of people with pink eye, conjunctivitis in the dairy workers. And even though there weren't that many that were confirmed, it's pretty clear that they were being impacted. And so they were, I think, concerned about, could this become widespread? And if there is human-to-human transmission, which CDC said there's still no real evidence of that, then that would be very concerning.
Okay, so they're keeping a pulse on that. Great.
One question that I probably missed a little bit, I want to know more, like if a producer suspects about a case, what they should do, like how they should treat that animal, or here in Colorado they should call you, like what are the things that
no,
they
don't
should...
call me.
What is the first action that a producer should take if they suspect that they have a virus in their farm?
So ideally, they probably should be talking to the veterinarian about a plan beforehand, especially if it's in their general area. Is what are we going to do if this does show up on the farm? What might it look like? So it may look like mastitis, which farms deal with mastitis on a weekly, if not daily basis, right? They could have respiratory signs. But what I think the biggest thing that we see in almost all the farms is they go from having 10 cows in their sick pen, and now they've got 20, and now they've got 40, and it essentially can double every day for a period of days. So they will notice pretty quickly that something is going on. Most of the cattle have responded that we hear about have responded pretty well to electrolytes and oral therapy.
Excellent.
So really working with your veterinarian on
Yes.
those processes. Great. So Jason, can you talk a little bit more about the milk supply in the United States and its safety? And I mean safety on farm, for the consumer, just milk in general. So we know that the virus is in milk. That's how it's being tested. That's how herds are being discovered, right? That when they have high path. But can you talk to us a little bit about milk broadly?
Sure. So initially there were some studies that were conducted, and it's hard to put. So this is the influenza A virus was classified as a select agent. So you have to have certain protocols and essentially a biosecurity laboratory to work with this in order to do research. So it was really hard to set up the first experiments where they looked at pasteurization in terms of is it killing the virus. And those studies have been done. There's been more studies since then that shows that, yes, pasteurization does neutralize and destroy the virus. So that's really good.
That's great.
The concern,
so the milk I'm feeding my kids is safe.
Not whole milk.
yes.
No, it is whole
So
milk.
it's whole milk.
No,
Pasteurized
just not
whole
raw milk.
Not
Yeah.
raw milk.
Yes.
So raw
Right.
milk is a whole nother story.
Whole is
and
great.
and I think most veterinarians, well, I shouldn't say most veterinarians, but most public health related people are focused on, do not drink raw milk, do not provide raw milk to your children, because of a lot of other different diseases
Sure.
that could be
Sure. Pasteurization was developed a very long time ago.
for a good reason.
And for a good reason. Sure.
So, and it's still protecting us against high path AI.
That's great.
So don't drink raw milk.
Great.
If you're concerned about some of the potential
Sure.
health effects you can have from some of the bacteria that are normally going to become contaminated in the milking process, and for some of the viruses, well, the virus we know of. Right.
No, also avoid feeding that to calves potentially, right?
Right. And so there's a lot of farms that feed pasteurized waste milk, and the reason that they do that is to prevent them from getting sick from some of these
Sure.
bacterial agents. So
To the calves, that is.
to the
Sure.
calves. So if it's good enough for people, it's good enough for calves to take the same kind of mitigations to reduce illness. So yes, pasteurization is a good thing. I think one of the things that we've learned probably in the last 3 or 4 months with this disease is that we've had a lot of wild, large cats across the United States that have become infected with this through either the feeding of raw, contaminated poultry products, but small cats with raw milk. So anything raw at this point that comes from dairy cattle or poultry is probably not a good idea to be feeding anything.
Perfect.
to.
So
It's good to know.
milk
Great.
in the store is safe, right?
Yes.
Whole 1%, 2%. As
Whole
long
milk.
as-
Whole milk,
Yes.
please.
Whole milk.
Pasteurized.
And that's what my kids drink. Whole milk. Pasteurized whole milk. Yes. But basically, pasteurization and cook everything for animals, people, etc.
Right.
So, Jason, what's up next for your research?
So we're just finishing up on-farm studies of cows and shedding and looking at antibody levels. So we're going back to these farms 6-7 months later and doing antibody tests. So that's kind of looking at how long is this immunity going to last that they've got during their infectious period.
Sure.
The other thing that I think is really the thing that is, two things. It really ties to transmission, though. And I think that with some of the research that's come out recently and all the information that we've gathered, I think we've got at least in my brain and a little bit on paper, I think we've got a good idea of how transmission might be occurring at the cow level. And so,
Great.
given that when we go onto a farm and we find that 90 to 100% of the animals have antibodies in a fairly short period of time, that tells me that they can't be all exposed just through the milking process.
Sure.
So I think that we're getting more and more information. There was actually
And they weren't all sick, clearly, either.
Right.
Correct. Sure.
Right. And that goes along with what we heard about the research with the cows and I should tell the whole story of that research is that they had 2 cows that were infected, that they infected with the virus in the udder, and they were taking those milking machines and going to the 2 non-affected cows to see if they could transmit it through the milking machines, and they couldn't do that in this particular study. So they're like, well, what are we going to do? So they started pouring the milk over the feed of the 2 uninfected cows, and then, like I said, after a period of time, then they looked at antibody levels, and those cows did develop antibodies prior to then the intramammary challenge, and the cows didn't get sick after that. So I think that that could be why we see fewer clinical cases than maybe we would expect given the level of immunity in the herd. So if the cows are getting exposed through the oral or respiratory route and become essentially immune because they're creating antibodies, then even if they do get exposed via the mammary system, then they wouldn't necessarily show clinical signs. Sure. So I think we're seeing some of that when we see some of the non-clinical cows where they may have one sample that we've collected over 10 weeks that's positive in the milk with a very, very low amount of virus. So I think that there's multiple ways that it can be transmitted from cow to cow, but I think the majority of cows are not through the mammary gland. Mm-hmm. So that's the within herd piece. And then from the herd to herd piece, we're actually working with some other scientists at CSU to look at air movement. And I hadn't thought about this much until I talked to him a couple of weeks ago, because we'd go and we'd look at weather patterns and say, well, look, the wind is in the right direction to support movement from farm A to farm B.
This farm is sick. There was wind. Now this farm gets sick. Yeah, right. You draw a conclusion, sure.
Right. The problem is that there's a time lapse, right? Between that, it's not like it happened today on one farm and tomorrow on the next, because those animals have to get exposed. It takes them a little while the virus to get going, cause illness. But our weather is predicted every day based on where the air is coming from that they're predicting. Sure. So after talking to the atmospheric scientist folks, they're like, well, we can predict with our NOAA models where the air came from a week ago that are on the farms today. And we could even go back further. It's not going to be as accurate.
Sure.
But so looking at that in a more precise way in terms of, could the air from, specifically in California, could the air around all the farms in the Southern Valley, does that make sense that it moves up? I mean, we know there's generally a southern breeze, but can we kind of put more scientific merit to that approach? And there was actually just a paper that came out last week, a preprint, that in the Czech Republic showed through some infected poultry farms and genetic sequencing and epidemiology and weather that they showed that it's very, very likely that it moved through poultry farms with aerosol transmission. So we're getting more and more evidence that's how it could be moving, which is, it's good to know, but it is going to be frustrating from a biosecurity perspective, because all you can really do is vaccinate and hope your cattle have good immunity if it comes back into your area.
Biosecurity, not much you can do with air. Right.
Wish the wind turns the other way. Just
what's that?
You just wish the wind would turn the other way.
Right.
No, that's excellent. That's a lot of information, Jason. Thank you.
And thank you, Jason, for all of your work. Right. This has been
a year.
An exciting year because it's in your field, but one that I'm sure has been exhausting and taxing and hard all at the same time. So thank you for all of your efforts, keeping my kids able to keep drinking milk and not having it cost $15 a gallon. We appreciate you. We appreciate you for keeping the public safe as well. So thank you for your efforts here.
Where can people find, you mentioned a lot of information, research coming out and a lot of things coming out every week probably. Is there any hub, any place that people can find information about HPAI in dairy cows?
Yeah, so USDA has a lot of information on their website. Colorado Department of Agriculture has information as well. As far as the studies that are coming out now, I don't know of any place where those are getting put up for people to go out and look at. But if you do a Google search, you will find a lot of information that's been coming out. There's been a lot of people that have been really busy investigating and researching this disease.
And we'll make sure to get all Jason's pubs on agnext.colostate.edu.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Jason.
Yes. Thank you.
So, go ahead. Is there any other questions? Is there anything that we didn't cover that you want to mention here about HPAI?
Well, one thing that you did mention a little bit, and you mentioned it a little bit in $15 milk, but we do know that it's impacted the milk supply in the states that it's been in. And I don't recall off the top of my head what it was in Colorado when it was here last July, but I just saw some numbers last week from California where there's been, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of almost 900 herds that have been impacted. But California in December was down 8% in their milk production.
Wow.
Which is pretty significant.
Absolutely. And I think it's important when we talk about these things to kind of pull it back to sustainability, right? And these sorts of issues, right, challenges that our group looks at and researches and discovers, right, there's huge impacts across the spectrum, across the entire food system. And so an 8% decline in California milk is significant.
It's big. And from a disease perspective, we've mentioned this before, but the amount of, if you think about if a farm is implementing all the personal protective equipment that's recommended, and how costly that is, and all the testing that's been conducted, and all the consumables that are gone through. I mean, this is an unsustainable situation. We got to get out of this, right?
Health is always, right,
Yes.
the lowest hanging fruit when we think about sustainability, for sure.
Absolutely. Great. Thanks, Jason. Thank you very much, Dr. Lombard, for coming and joining our podcast. Thank you to our listeners for joining us to another AgNext podcast. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn. If you have comments, suggestions, feedback that you would like to give us, please send an email to agnext.colostate.edu, and we'll do our best to answer your questions as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.